if we're going to give up on something like trumpeter swans, then functionally we would give up on the value of wetlands. So we are, in this era now, we are learning much more about the bigger societal benefits of wetlands. Trumpeter swan use of those wetlands is just one side story. As we learn more about climate change and the valuable role that wetlands play in mitigating some of the detrimental effects of weather patterns and whatnot, now we're learning that we face a little bit of a crisis, whether it's flooding or drought, two ends of the spectrum. Wetlands play an important role in both of those types of things. And so we have our own selfish purposes for managing wetlands better today than we did 10 years ago and 100 years ago. And trumpeter swans is one species that will really benefit from proper stewardship of wetlands.
What is happening, everybody? Welcome to Your Forest. This is the podcast where we talk about environmental sciences and other related topics. And today's is a really interesting one regarding a super important species, trumpeter swans. Trumpeter swans are this big, giant bird with 2.5 meter wingspans, and they're about 30 pounds. And there was a conservation problem early in this century, or in the 20th century, and I wanted to bring on Mark Heckbert, who is a provincial wildlife conflict specialist, and he really is a scholar when it comes to trumpeter swans, the history, the conservation efforts, the biology of them, all kinds of different stuff, the issues that arose when we started to recognize the population decline and that kind of stuff. And yeah, it was a great conversation. He really knows his stuff. We got right into it, talked about why it's important to care about these species, talked about the biology a bit, some of the challenges, the history behind them, why they were in decline, and their actual inevitable, or not inevitable, but their eventual population increase, which is a huge success for wildlife conservation, period. And we don't hear a lot about that, when it comes to wildlife conservation. It's a lot of doom and gloom. So it's awesome to hear a positive outcome from one of these efforts, right? It's been a 100-year effort, but it's been positive. So I think you guys will love it. Sponsors for this episode, Greenlink Forestry. Thank you so much. Couldn't do this without the support of Greenlink. Also, Damaged Timber. Damaged Timber is an apparel company. You can go to damagetimber.com and get 10% off everything you do by putting Your Forest 10 at checkout. And they put 10% of all their earnings towards a environmental sciences scholarship. So it's a good way to support the industry just by wearing clothes. And the primary sponsor and most important sponsor is West Fraser. West Fraser, through their funding is made available through the Forest Resource Improvement Association of Alberta. And I couldn't thank them enough. Without this, I wouldn't be doing this. Without them, I wouldn't be doing this. I need money to justify to pay for all the advertising and trying to get it out there. And I really appreciate everything you guys are doing for me. So thanks so much. And without any further messing around, let's get into it. Let's talk about trumpeter swans. Great episode. Like I said, Mark's an awesome dude. Really knows his stuff. Let's do it.
Yeah, so I'm Mark Heckbert, and I'm by training a wildlife biologist, and I have been employed with Alberta Environment Parks for 25 years. Been always just absolutely fascinated by waterfowl, and people will tell you their story, I think, and how it evolved into this, and some of it's purely professional. Mine, I'm very blessed that it's been a combination of just absolute passion for waterfowl. And
that's the best way to do it.
Well,
right?
my right from an early age, and I can't put my finger on one particular moment or why that is, but my kids still make fun of me today that the only thing I can draw is a goose or a duck. Goose or a duck. Right? So I've had the passion for a long time, and really fortunate, I think, to be able to apply that. Not everybody gets that opportunity in their careers. One certain pivotal moment for me as it relates to trumpeter swans, I was a I was a university student working in Elk Island National Park in 1990. And at that time, national parks, in cooperation with the Canadian Wildlife Service and Alberta Fish and Wildlife, were in the middle of a program where they were trying to reestablish breeding pairs of trumpeter swans inside Elk Island National Park. And as part of that process, breeding pairs and their broods of trumpeter swans were being captured up around Grand Prairie in late August, mid to late August, and translocated into suitable wetlands in Elk Island, hard released, basically transported by road from Grand Prairie to Elk Island, in dog kennels or cages like that,
Right.
as a family unit, and then released onto the wetland. And the hope, and it certainly was backed up with some science, is that the adults would likely not return to Elk Island the following spring, but where the cygnets learn to fly should be the area, the broad area that they should be returned to.
Cygnets is the babies.
That's right.
Yeah, okay.
And so this was my first exposure to an active management program for trumpeter swans. And so here we are, helping to unload these massive creatures out of these dog kennels. And I remember one of the national park wardens saying, Mark, reach in there and grab that big white one out of the dog kennel there. and you kind of, look with astonishment, like, okay, there's got to be a bit of trust here, that this is going to be okay. And so I reached in there and I was thinking, like, some of us at least have had experience with tame geese in farmyards or turkeys or things like that.
I got a scar on my belly button from a turkey.
big birds with pointy things, right? And so here I am reaching into this dog kennel, and I wrap my arms around an adult male trumpeter swan that's 12 kilograms, 26, 27 pounds, that's had a long day and had a very traumatic start to his morning, being netted and captured and no idea what's happening next or whatever. And so here I reach in and I wrap my arms around this thing. Not a lot of occupational health and safety attention in 1990 about what were the best practices here. And so just get in there and get her done. And I reach in there and wrap my arms around this thing. And here I'm holding this thing, and the head is 2 feet plus, towering above mine, and the bird is absolutely docile.
Really? Huh.
Unbelievable. I'm holding the wings, and I'm ready for one of those wings to pop out and just beat the living daylights out of me. I've heard all these stories of how some of the early wildlife biologists in doing nesting surveys were knocked off horses.
Wow.
By aggressive swans defending nests and broke their arm and things like that, right? And so here I'm bracing for this, and here is this bird, certainly stressed. I can feel its heart through all of those feathers. Feel its heart pounding, and here's this bird, absolutely docile. Little bit of movement on its head as it's looking around, trying to pay attention to where its mate is and where the cygnets are and who else is there, and we're to be absolutely quiet.
Yeah.
And here I'm just holding this thing there, and then I must have been taking far too long, just trying to take in the whole moment, right? Because somebody said, "So you need to let it go now." Right, that's what we're here for. And so you walk down to the edge, and they had built a kind of a chicken wire 2x2 pen that would hold the family group for a number of hours together to kind of reestablish those bonds, because they had been transported in separate accommodations but together in the same truck.
Right.
Chance to reestablish those bonds together, and so we placed these birds down into that chicken wire enclosure there, and then everybody left, and then a few hours later one person came back, opened the gate, and the family group swam out as a unit onto their temporary new home, but what we hoped would be the return location for those cygnets to come back and establish.
Did that happen?
It did, absolutely. Good. And so
That's
I mean,
pretty cool.
that was just an incredible experience, and the start, and it's something that I had to put aside for a number of years because it wasn't until the late 90s and early 2000s where Alberta moved forward with the recovery planning process and some additional actions that there was an opportunity for me to participate again.
Is that unique to you? Like, were you just lucky with that swan that it wasn't going to beat your ass, but or is that common with when they're in the pens like
yeah,
that?
it's common. Certainly when trumpeter swans become a little bit more habituated, and there are a number of places where swans are kept captively.
Yeah.
City of Camrose is our closest example here, where you can go every day down to Mirror Lake and see swans that are held under a captive permit.
Oh.
They certainly become far more aggressive when they become habituated over time under that captivity situation. But in the wild, they are unique. Most wildlife will fight hard to get out of that situation there, and for whatever reason, swans behaviorally are very docile.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
Huh. And just so people can have a picture in their mind, these trumpeter swans, they look like your typical, like your Disney swan, right? Like they're a white, long-necked kind of thing with a black bill.
Yeah, right? I mean, they are an incredible beast. I mean, they are North America's largest native waterfowl.
Oh, they are? Okay.
They are all white, with the exception of their black bill and their black feet. Cygnets, which are the young, as we've discussed, are gray in their first year, and then we'll molt those young feathers out to transition to full white.
Okay.
They are very, similar to our tundra swan, but only in the sense that they're a little bit bigger. And tundra swans tend to have a yellow dot kind of at the base of their eye and the top of their bill.
Oh, okay.
If we were to see a trumpeter swan and a tundra swan flying together, we would likely not be able to tell the difference. But the true difference, and really the only difference other than size, which is difficult to tell in flight or on the water, but the true difference is their very resonant trumpeter call. And if you've ever heard it, you will never forget it. It is exactly like a trumpet. Tundra swans are more of making a hoo-hoo sound, and trumpeters are just like somebody's got a bugle pressed up against their lips there and are tooting away on that.
See, that makes me think that I've never heard them, which sucks.
You probably haven't, but we can point you in some places where we can make that happen.
Yeah, I definitely want to experience that one day. I remember, I just know how awesome it feels when you hear a bunch of like blue herons going over or something like that, which is I don't hear very often, but when I do hear it, right, it's like, oh, that's clearly, I know exactly what that is, right? Yes, so right. I'm sure it would be like if I knew what to listen for, I'm sure I'd probably even know it if I was just out in the bush and heard it, right? I think actually, you know what? I think I did see a pair this last hunting season when I was out hunting elk. I remember actually seeing a pair fly over, and I remember it blew my mind. I didn't hear them trumpet out or anything like that, but yeah, they're a cool species.
Yeah, and if they're in a pair like that, it was likely that's what they were.
Okay.
They are they're such an iconic species in terms of what they require to live their life. They are a species, and we'll speak to this in terms of the management actions that we've undertaken. But they are a species that's very sensitive to disturbance. So from an ecological standpoint, they're fragile in that sense, in that they take a long time to mature. They take a long time to form pair bonds.
Okay.
They take a long time to figure out where they're going to make their home. Their kids take a long time to grow.
Everything like people.
They have so many similarities.
Yeah.
For example, trumpeter swans take about 5 years to reach sexual maturity.
Okay.
Then they start looking around for a mate.
That's pretty unheard of in the animal kingdom besides primates, right?
It's very long. Yeah, absolutely. Right. In the case where we've got some wildlife species who are born and mating and producing litters in the same year of their birth, right? This is in sharp contrast to that. And so once they reach 5 years now, the challenge is to find another mate that's of the same age and reproductive potential as that. And so now we're dealing with the male is called a cob, the female is called a pen.
Okay.
And so then they take some time, often measured in more than one season, to find a wetland, try it out, before they make that decision to nest. And they're looking for a bunch of things. They're looking for security on that wetland. Mm-hmm. Is that a quiet, low disturbance kind of place? Does that have enough grub for us to survive there?
Okay.
These are birds. I mentioned the weight of that initial trumpeter swan that I was able to hold there at 12 kilograms, so pushing 30 pounds on that. Believe it or not, they will eat their weight daily in aquatic macrophytes. And so this is the tubers and the roots and the bottom stems of aquatic plants, submerged aquatic plants.
Wow.
It's unbelievable.
It's a hell of a stomach.
So the phrase that I'm maybe going to refer to, like that guy eats like something through a goose.
Okay.
Well, this is where this comes from, is the ecology of waterfowl. Okay. They have a extremely poor reproductive tracts, and so they're cycling through incredible volumes of food to draw the nutrition out of that.
Yeah, that's really inefficient. Oh, weird.
So we have certainly some wetlands in Alberta, and these are mostly spring staging wetlands that are smaller in size and get an incredible density of swans for a short period of time, typically in the spring, but also, again, a little bit in the fall.
Okay.
That can, over a period of years, with enough swans present, can basically harvest all of the available aquatic plants, submerged aquatic plants in that wetland.
Right.
And
if you're pulling the roots out, then you're actually really slowing down the return of that vegetation.
That's right. Too, and so you do need a special wetland to have that ecological capacity to grow that biomass in there to support swans. And so even a pair of swans goes through such a huge volume of food in a year. That is why there's typically only one pair of swans nesting on any given wetland in a year.
Gotcha. Okay.
So you can picture this pair of swans is testing out this wetland from a number of characteristics. Is it big enough? Does it have enough food? Is it quiet enough? And does it have a suitable nesting spot? And they build a huge nest. Mm. So typically a couple of meters across. They're often using a beaver lodge or a muskrat push-up as the base, and then they're building on top of that. Mm. They'll
using sticks and grass and stuff, or
almost exclusively vegetation like bulrushes, cattails, horsetail, to form that nest bowl, and then they'll begin to form the down nest bowl, and of course the pen removes the down from her breast feathers, breast area, and she will take that, form a nice bowl around there, and then they begin the process of laying between 3 and 9 eggs. They lay an egg a day, like most birds do, and then about 35 days of incubation. Most of the incubation is done by the female, and the male takes his role as protector and observer very seriously, and so you can see that they've got quite a division of duties here.
Yeah.
And but clearly the pen cannot go 35 days without eating, and so she'll slide off the nest. The male will slide on for a couple of hours and give mom a break while she's out foraging, and then it's back to mom again for most of the time there.
That's cool. So what makes them so vulnerable to disturbance, or like repeated disturbance?
Unknown. some wildlife species have done really well in the presence of humans.
Yeah.
Think about coyotes, ravens, crows,
White-tailed deer, probably.
White-tailed deer, you know, some have not. Think grizzly bears, woodland caribou, and trumpeter swans. You know, really as the poster children for quiet, remote places that have not done well on, you know, forest disturbance and access and human interaction.
Right.
Trumpeters are it's just the way they are, and really a lot of their
they just don't like to be disturbed. Period.
Yeah, and so they were certainly one of the first waterfowl species to take it really on the chin as North America was settled, particularly for agriculture. So a combination of wetland drainage and consumptive use, you know, realistically overhunting prior to the regulatory framework that basically saved North American waterfowl in its current form.
Right. So this is we're talking 1800s, early 1900s.
That's right.
Yeah. So
that's
they were
right.
almost hunted to. Gotcha.
So they took a huge decline, and this is where Alberta's story begins for trumpeter swans. Is not only in Alberta but North American wide, we were down what they believed to be less than 100 individuals by say 1920.
Yeah, that's wild. And this is not like this is unprecedented, right? We know that this is because of human interaction in the environment. Right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the best that we can see that there weren't other, you know, ecological factors that led to that. It was just pure human use and alteration of the landscape, and it was occurring across North America. Trumpeter swans were broadly spread across North America, from the most remote places in the Yukon down to the most settled places, you know, in the middle of the U.S. and central U.S. there. And the same story was for grizzly bears and wolves, right? And so the same story has repeated itself in our history and evolution as we interact with those wildlife species. So here now starts basically both the Canadian and the U.S. model of conservation for swans. And, you know, like a lot of stories, there were one or two concerned individuals.
I was going to say, how did they, back then, before there was really any framework for paying attention to this kind of stuff, how did we realize there was only 100, right? Because I imagine this is before banding, this is before really population dynamics was being, you know, really paid attention to. So
yeah, certainly in the U.S., where trumpeter swan conservation started was with one individual by the name of George Wright, and George was a young guy straight out of school. But he was hired on with the first development of the national park system in the U.S. And national parks understood early in their evolution that if they didn't have a good inventory of what the wildlife were, how would they go about strategically the process of designated land base for national parks? They had to have an objective. And his job was to complete wildlife inventories on the various areas that were under consideration for national parks. And one of the first species that absolutely came on his radar was trumpeter swans. And in fact, interestingly, you know, we always seem to be having a budget discussion in Alberta.
Right.
Well, you want to talk about a real budget discussion. George Wright paid for the first 2 years of wildlife inventories out of his own pocket.
Wow. For
the national park system. And then he was all across the United States doing these wildlife inventories. And then tragically, at the age of 32 years of age, he was killed in a car crash while doing wildlife inventories down along the U.S.-Mexico border as they were looking for places to establish new national parks. Certainly, as somebody in the business, I wonder what might have been if George Wright hadn't lost his life at age 32 years and had been able to carry on what he had already started.
Yeah.
And so he started, there's a direct connection to Alberta here. He recognized that in what we call the tri-state area, which is Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho, where their borders intersect in there, that there was a unique geomorphological series of wetlands and geothermal kind of springs in that area that kept a number of lakes and rivers open during the winter there.
Gotcha.
And he completed some census and found that basically the remaining trumpeter swans in the United States were wintering in this area.
Gotcha.
And so he established, the first national park system, national wildlife refuge system that was solely based on conservation of trumpeter swans, and that was back in the early 1930s, and they call it the Red Rock Lakes area.
Okay, that's awesome. So that at that point we already knew, or that's when we first realized, was because of him, that they were down to under 100 individuals in North America. That's crazy.
That's right. And so he was completing those surveys in the winter, and there's also a series of birds associated with that wetland complex, and then as well into Yellowstone, that were summering there and living there year round. The challenge is that reproductively they weren't doing particularly well there, and if we think about their ecological needs with respect to food, if they're eating this much food year round on that wetland without giving it any time to rest, it shouldn't come as a surprise that the condition of the adults will not be as good as birds that have an unlimited access to food.
For sure.
And therefore they weren't producing as many eggs, they weren't hatching out as many cygnets, the cygnet survival was not as good. And so they were either in a stagnant kind of population situation or slightly declining. And that's when investigations into Alberta started, and it was basically discovered into the 1930s and 40s that the only remaining nesting trumpeter swans were found in that area immediately around what is today the city of Grand Prairie and into the county of Grand Prairie. And the numbers were also extremely low.
Yeah,
less than 100 individuals. Those were the early start to us understanding what do these birds need in the summer, and then where do they go? And so that's, we started some early banding programs, and we're able to see that some of those Grand Prairie birds were ending up wintering down at Red Rock Lakes and into Yellowstone and places like that. Okay, so now we've answered a basic biological question.
Right.
Where are they in the summer? Where are they in the winter? And now we start to look at what do they need and how do we set recovery goal objectives and whatnot. And so basically from the period of the early 1950s up until the mid-1980s, the Canadian Wildlife Service was principally responsible for the census effort on the breeding grounds. And it was limited basically to that immediate area around Grand Prairie. And so they would count annually, and this would be aerial surveys done with a small fixed-wing aircraft. And what they saw is, very low numbers, very consistent use of certain lakes there, a little bit of increase through to the 1970s. And then things started to kind of take off into the 1980s. Ecologically, very slow compared to what we're used to. We look at other waterfowl and we can see that in a given year, waterfowl populations, depending on grass conditions and water conditions, can explode or detract dramatically by millions in a given year. Basically, if they don't hatch out successful broods across North America, we've got population differences of millions in a given year. And certainly hundreds of thousands amongst individual species. Well, here now we're talking about trumpeter swans, where we've seen, maybe 20 or 30 birds difference from year to year.
Yeah,
very slow increases.
Well, that 5-year, to maturity time seems like it's probably a bit of a hamper on that. Yeah.
So biologists down in the United States and Canada began to cooperate. And this, I think, is, again, one of the more unique wildlife management programs that bonds us as Canadians and Americans. There are very few others that I can think of where we share this resource because it's migratory, and we basically split it 50-50. We have North American waterfowl dominating the Canadian landscape from the end of April and the beginning of May until the end of October. And our U.S. counterparts have stewardship responsibilities of those same birds from November back again until April.
Gotcha.
So breeding and summering in Canada and wintering and staging in the United States in the winter.
Well, it's amazing. Like that the episode I had a few episodes ago with Patty and Richard about bird migration, and we were talking about just bird populations in general and how do we think the science behind population management and understanding what the populations are doing. They were really hitting home that exact fact, right? Unless we know where they're wintering and where they're summering and kind of what connects those two things, it's pretty hard because you can't just do everything you can in Canada and do nothing down in the States and expect it to be okay.
Right.
So it has to be a cross-border effort, and it's amazing that managed to happen with this unique species with the trumpeter swan, because it seems like we have problems with that kind of communication. I mean, I'm not sure about with the States, but I mean with lots of the songbirds that go down to South America, I mean that's a totally different realm of politics and complications. So it seems like it's encouraging to see that that actually worked out, right?
Yeah, and there was early recognition that if we could do lots of positive things on the breeding grounds, or similarly lots of positive things on the wintering grounds, and if those two management actions weren't in sync, we wouldn't be any further ahead on the management, right?
Yeah.
So ecologically, here we're beginning to realize that trumpeter swans were breeding here and wintering down in this place, which was a little bit of an odd place. It was geographically restricted, and it was a tough place, and so it certainly had this geothermal influence that was keeping water open, and trumpeter swans were piling into there. Canadian trumpeter swans were piling into there for the winter.
Make it sound like they have a passport.
Yeah, snowbirds, right? Piling into there, but then occasionally facing disaster, because inevitably it does snow and does freeze hard in all parts of North America. And so these birds, and I have often either described them as incredibly lazy or incredibly brilliant.
Okay.
And so they were only going as far south on their migration as they needed to. So they're not going down to the Gulf of Mexico. They're not going to California. They're not going to South America. They go to Yellowstone. They go 300 or 400 miles south of the border and then hang out there and eke it out. And what they're foraging on in those early days was some rather nutritionally poor aquatic plants found in rivers. And so these birds were not actually sitting on the warm lakes, thermal lakes, but those thermal lakes would influence the temperature on the downstream portions of the river, keeping those portions mostly open and mostly ice-free until there was a big snowstorm. And then what we were facing is we may see the loss of several hundred trumpeter swans at one particular location because the river froze over.
Right. And
so we had, I guess, what we would describe as kind of a dangerous ecology situation happening here. Highly vulnerable. And so the U.S. And Canadian managers believed that one of the solutions was going to be to try and broaden out the winter range of these birds.
Okay.
And this is where it ties back into the story about Elk Island.
I was going to say, how do you convince, but I guess that's how you do it. How do you convince them to move the way you guys did it?
They were doing a whole bunch of things. And so on the wintering grounds, in the early years, and I think many wildlife management agencies have had experience with this and then mostly stopped this practice, but they were feeding swans on the wintering grounds. And so this idea that, well, they can't make it on their own, and so we'll supplement the feed with them. And that went on for many, many, many years. And yes, worked, but doesn't really address the ecological problem.
It's not sustainable.
It's a stopgap, right?
Yeah.
And so then you would get situations where those birds became absolutely dependent on that feed. And so now we're dealing with a completely frozen stretch of the river, and we're feeding swans on the banks of that river, right? And so, yes, short term, long term, that isn't going to work at all. So there was a combination of trying to force those birds off to other water bodies, translocating them on the winter grounds. So again, like we did up in Grand Prairie, capturing these birds on the winter ground and physically moving them to another place that thought might meet their ecological needs.
In hopes that the cygnets would pick up on that and
Yeah, and then across the United States and then over into Ontario, there was a concerted effort again to reintroduce trumpeter swans using the same technique as we did here, capturing family groups and forcing them over to what looked from an ecological perspective to be a perfectly good place for trumpeter swans to breed.
Okay.
And so we would start to force those birds over and whatnot. And those transplant programs take a long time. But if the recipe is correct, there's no reason why it shouldn't work. And it did start to work.
Okay.
And so what we saw now is that swans were much more widely distributed during the winter in the United States. We also began to see some different patterns in their reverse migration. And so they weren't all piling into Grand Prairie. They were pioneering and looking to different places. And so, interestingly enough, one of the original objectives in the transplant to Elk Island was the hope that these birds not only would establish breeding territory in Elk Island, but they would not migrate south down to Red Rock Lakes and Yellowstone. But in fact, there was a hope because there's a whole population of trumpeter swans along the west coast. That's called the Pacific population. The ones in Alberta that go down into the U.S. Are called the Rocky Mountain population. And then everything that would be east of the Rocky Mountain population, including birds in Ontario and east central United States, is called the interior population. So 3 flyways of birds classed roughly on their geographic pattern of migration.
Right.
And so the
same
early
species, right?
Same species.
Slight difference in like adaptions for different food types.
Yeah,
I'm sure.
but probably nothing different genetically. Too.
Yeah, it's probably like the argument between a brown bear and a grizzly bear, right? It's just different diet or whatever.
Different diet, yes. Maybe slightly different ecology and chronology on their activities and things like that. So this idea was that could it be that if we brought swans and had them reestablished in Elk Island, that they actually would do an east-west migration out to the coast?
Okay.
A big assumption.
Yeah.
Some of those early birds at Elk Island were radio collared, and they did not do any of that behavior.
I was going to say, how would you... So this is just a hope, like, hey, maybe they'll do this. There wasn't any active implementation of trying to get them to do that.
My predecessors didn't have any real knowledge or understanding to support that, but the idea was okay. I think looking back, it was much stronger that they were going to achieve success in getting breeding activity in Elk Island and not necessarily win the day on the wintering situation. So anyway, they put on.
What's the benefit? Sorry to cut you off. What's the benefit of having them go to the coast to winter instead of just going down somewhere in the States?
Well, the coast has a broad winter range and a very favorable wintering climate for survival of swans. Okay. And so the rationale was that rather than continue to add more Canadian birds into a really tiny place that's already overcrowded and quite frankly has really poor food resources, could we possibly roll the dice and get these birds to winter out on the coast around Vancouver and Oregon and places like that?
Well, I imagine, this is just me pontificating, but I imagine the reason there's only 3 real distinct populations across is because there probably were everywhere at one point and then everywhere in between died out. And those 3 populations are the ones that managed to survive because they found the perfect little niche of migration pattern or whatever.
That's right. But certainly the ones in the Rocky Mountain population were most at risk just because of that poor winter habitat.
Right.
So they radio collared a couple of these original pioneer birds, adult birds, into Elk Island there, tracked them in their first fall and winter and found that they went a grand total of 60 miles over to the open water on the cooling pond on Wabamun Lake where the power generating station was there. And then tried to rather unsuccessfully eke it out there, and who knows where the kids went. Those
Right.
were just the adult birds.
I'll say because I know when I was doing a little bit of research on these, it sounded like these birds can survive extended periods of like -30, so they can actually handle the winter temperature. It's just the open water for food that they need, right?
That's right. They have a number of biological adaptations on their, physiological adaptations on them. Number one is they have 25,000 feathers, and so if you've put on your Canada goose parka lately and reveled in the warmth of that beauty, that down is an amazing insulating material, and so they've got all that ability, but the Achilles heel is that they've got to have open water to eat.
And obviously -30 doesn't often allow for open water.
That's right. And so again, here is either the world's most laziest bird or the most intelligent bird that realized as they were flying south, hey, wait a sec, check that out.
Yeah.
There's open water there and it's only 60 miles. So this will be awesome. We don't have to fly all the way down there and compete with there's no one else here.
Well, I mean, look at people, right? Like, well, we would do the same. We'd make the same decision, right? Like, why put all this extra energy into going so far when it's just right there, right?
That's right. That's right.
We're equally as lazy and brilliant.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
So there was a combination leading up into the 70s and 80s of 20 and 25 years of these efforts, both on the breeding grounds to document what we have and where they are found, and then in the wintering grounds to reduce the risk and spread that out, doing some transplants, doing some forcing work, doing some other encouraging work, and then counting them both on the wintering grounds and the summering grounds, start to understand what truly is a limiting factor. Is there anything on the breeding grounds that maybe the production just isn't that great? Maybe we're just not hatching out a lot of kids there. And so comparing what was produced on the breeding grounds to what actually wintered successfully down south.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah. They're complicated species for sure. So at what point do we start to see that what you would call a successful, a sustainable increase in population that seems like whatever the efforts that we're putting into this are working and they're becoming self-sufficient and we don't have to maybe be as hands-on? At what point did that kind of happen?
Yeah. So if give a bit of a synopsis of the history of the census, and this is census on the breeding grounds, so not winter numbers. This is reproductive effort.
Okay.
1954, the Canadian Wildlife Service had estimated 232 birds in Canada.
Still nothing.
Nothing. Yeah. High risk, right?
That's across all three populations, the coastal and
It's only the interior population in Alberta.
Gotcha.
But the Canadian birds were making up 90+% of the birds in the Rocky Mountain population. So we had birds at Grand Prairie and birds nesting at Red Rock Lakes and Yellowstone, but we were talking 50 birds down in the United States that were living there year round.
Oh, okay.
And so Canada and Alberta in particular was absolutely critical to that particular portion of the Rocky Mountain population.
Gotcha.
So 1954, 232 birds. By 1985, that number had crept up only to 373 birds.
Oh, wow. Okay,
so things start to gain momentum here into the 80s and into the 90s. By 1990, 457. So a 22.5% increase from 1985. Then by 1995, we're now up to just about 800 birds.
Oh, that's a big jump.
Which is a huge jump, 73% in 5 years.
Yeah.
By the year 2000, we're just shy of 1,000 birds. By 2005, we're at 1,600 birds. 2010, we're at 2,800 birds.
Nice.
And the huge jump was in 2015, 7,700
Wow,
birds.
That's incredible.
So 174% jump in a 5-year time period.
Man, you never hear, like, I find a lot of times when you're looking into conservation efforts and everything that we're trying to do to try and bring animals back, it always seems so doom and gloom, right? Because it's like, oh, okay, well, now these species are dependent on our interaction in order to keep them alive and viable on the landscape, and like this is not sustainable. We can't keep doing this forever. What happens if our economy drops and we don't have the funding for this anymore? We're going to lose them forever. But to hear something like this, where you actually have a successful, you know what I mean, a successful conservation effort where you really start to see real numbers go up. Like that's huge. It says a lot.
It does. It says a lot for our efforts, but it also says a lot about the time that it took to recover.
Yeah.
Because if we start doing the math here, it took 100 years.
Yeah.
And so this is a long, long process.
Yeah, no kidding.
With extensive cooperation amongst provincial, state, and federal, both Canadian and U.S. agencies to achieve that. And then we forget about maybe a lot of the unsung heroes. Like, what about the individual people who had stewardship programs for their pair of swans?
Yeah.
On the area that was near their home, and they did the monitoring, or they worked at establishing a local stewardship group, or they raised the money. And I think about, locally here, groups like the Friends of Elk Island Society that was a key funding partner to fund the federal government on the translocation of trumpeter swans. I know that they raised tens of thousands of dollars over the years to do that.
Because that's the main problem, right? Is a lack of funding, right, for these efforts, because it's hard to sell, right? It's a tough one.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So was there a lot of that going on? A lot of like individuals just taking it upon themselves to get involved and actually?
Absolutely.
Really?
And that is, I'm not sure.
Relatively a lot, I should say.
Yeah, I think so. And that was happening on both sides of the border, right?
Yeah.
And so why is that? Well, number one, maybe, could it be that I wasn't the only person in the world that had a passion for waterfowl?
Yeah, I hope not.
So there were clearly other people who had a deep connection to this.
Yeah.
Didn't give up. I mean, gosh, 100 years to reach where we're at today, right? And so no doubt that original conservation efforts were passed on by mothers and fathers to their kids as well, who probably took up that cause,
Sure.
So here we are. They've just absolutely exploded, certainly in the last decade. And so now what?
Yeah.
That's something, that is on our minds now. In the process to kind of establish the legal designation for trumpeter swans in Alberta, it's not a particularly long story there, but basically going back to about 1987 was the first time under the Alberta Wildlife Act that trumpeter swans were classified and their status officially evaluated and whatnot. And
what year was that again?
1987.
Oh, wow. So we knew in the 30s that they were down to 70 or 80 or whatever it was, under 100 individuals, and it took that long to get a status.
Yeah, that's right.
Wow.
That's right. So, I think that was not a situation that would be dissimilar in many states and provinces. Is the
status probably didn't exist.
Statusing process and the evaluation,
right.
Wasn't entrenched in legislation.
Gotcha.
And so certainly in Alberta there was monitoring going on, and no doubt some grass, like if you talk to some of the old time farm families at the County of Grand Prairie, there was absolutely stewardship activities going on to do their part for their pair of swans on the wetland that was adjacent to their farm and things like that. Right?
It's amazing that just helping out one breeding pair, making sure that they're okay, obviously had such a difference. Because you think about a breeding pair out of 100, like the impact that has ultimately down the line in the population when it eventually gets to 7,000. Like that's a huge, right? It's amazing that it's just crazy to think that actually made a difference, right? Because a lot of people would look at a pair of caribou or something and go, whatever, it's just two, who cares, right? And so it's interesting to note that the impact that does have is exponential over time, right?
And I think of North America's other imperiled whitebird, which is the whooping crane. And I think you look at these two species together and the change. The numbers of trumpeter swans in the early conservation effort days were not dissimilar from those that whooping cranes were faced with.
Gotcha.
So less than 100. And yet the whooping crane situation is far from secure. It's certainly much better than it was 50 years ago.
Right.
but nowhere near the recovery that Trumpeter Swans have done. And so somewhat interestingly, here we have the core Canadian flock of birds, the Alberta flock of birds, solely persisting in an agricultural area.
Huh.
So there's no doubt that those stewardship activities are in that long history of that was a major player. That's
crazy. It's very what's the word? I don't know. It's very enlightening and like exciting to hear that individuals can have a real impact, right? Like it's very empowering to hear that stuff matters. That's
cool. I
yeah.
mean, and no doubt there was some hard work done south of the border
for sure
to achieve and reduce that risk of winter mortality there. And then no doubt hard work north of the border on the efforts to make sure that we're counting accurately and have found all of the swans that were really there. Yeah. Because, I mean, in the early days, when you go start to look for something, if you just assume they're only found in one spot, you might be wrong.
Yeah.
And so we had to make sure that our efforts at counting them on the summer range were indeed reflective of what was really there.
Right. No, that makes sense.
So if we look back to 1987, they're classed as endangered in Alberta. It wasn't a decade later until 1997 that they were reevaluated again. And given some of the population change increase that was already starting to happen by that time, they were downlisted at that time to threatened.
Gotcha.
And so the broad process under which government agencies undertake status assessments basically looks at what is the base number of breeding individuals in the population, what is the geographic distribution, and what has been the trend in population over time. Those are the three broad things, and you can just replace the species name for any of them that you're evaluating and measure the risk based on those three broad categories.
So what is what is the hierarchy of status? So like if you said downgraded from whatever to threatened, so I'm guessing threatened is less serious, like less of a concern than whatever it was before, right?
Yeah.
So what is that hierarchy?
So at the bottom, in terms of lowest risk, would be not at risk.
Right.
The next status of increasing risk would be species of special concern.
So we're just paying attention to them, kind of thing.
It's meeting some of the risk categories, and it might be something that has a low population size but is broadly distributed, or it might be something that has a pretty good number of individuals, but they're very geographically restricted.
Oh, so highly.
If we may have one terrible event,
right?
That could basically eliminate Alberta's portions of that species. Right.
Okay.
So the next species up then is threatened, and then endangered.
Oh, okay. So it's just the four then. Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Right.
So endangered is you're talking like really like this is like if we don't act now, they're gone. That's it type thing.
Yeah. Faced with immediate extinction or extirpation. So extirpation would be removal from Alberta's geographic boundaries.
Not from the planet, just
correct.
Yeah.
Right.
Gotcha.
So with the threatened status in 1997, Alberta had some legislative changes, and in and around the year 2000, really ramped up with what is today's statusing process and evaluation process. And at that time, in and around 2000, 2001 was the formal establishment of the Endangered Species Conservation Committee.
Okay.
This was an MLA-chaired committee that had stakeholder representation from a broad representation of Alberta societal stakeholders. And so industry, agriculture, academia, First Nations, I won't get them all, but a fairly broad panel there, but chaired through a political process by an MLA. That committee would basically receive status reports that the government had completed, would review those status reports for each species, and then receive recommendations on what to do next.
Gotcha.
And so that committee made all of its recommendations to the minister of the day responsible for those processes. So over the years, typically the Minister of Environment is responsible for that.
For sure.
So at that time, an updated status report in the year 2000 was written for Trumpeter Swans. In about 2001, 2002, that made its way through the process to get to the Endangered Species Conservation Committee. At that time, they recommended that the status be maintained at threatened, and that was based on the fact that we still had less than 1,000 breeding individuals. Trumpeter swans were not showing a complete reestablishment of their, what we believe to be their original range in Alberta, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And so...
don't take your foot off the gas quite yet. Yeah.
That's right. And so the minister directed at that time that a recovery team be established to write a recovery plan. And that's where I entered the picture as the team lead. And during that period from roughly 2003 to 2012, we wrote 2 recovery plans in that time period. I led a number of the surveys on the breeding range 3 actually in Alberta, and then of course we know the story from a population perspective. We also know that today we sit with Trumpeter swans breeding northwest of Calgary for the first time in 150 years.
That's awesome.
And so things are generally have been really positive there. And in about 2014, having written a couple of these recovery plans and gone through that political process through the Endangered Species Conservation Committee, the minister requested that the Endangered Species Conservation Committee take a look at Trumpeter swan, and could Trumpeter swan be a candidate for a downlisting? And so it really didn't take too much time for us to take a look at that and say, you bet.
Yeah.
Everything is showing things are moving in the right direction. It doesn't mean that will always be that way.
Of course, populations have fluctuations. That's just the way of things.
But things are looking as good as they probably could be. And again, to your point about when often, like how often do we hear a positive species at risk recovery story here? This was one of them. And so we agreed. And then so in 2014, 2015, the legal process to downlist Trumpeter swans was completed. And so today they now sit as a species of special concern.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So they're just paying attention to them. And so my next question was going to be, do you ever see there being a point where this species will be sustainable, right? And I guess they kind of are sustainable. We're keeping an eye on them, but they are a sustainable, self-sustaining population. So are you still like capturing and moving them to different sites and moving them around to try and make sure that they're doing okay, or is that
most of those programs across North America are at a either wrapped up or nearly wrapped up for the most part? And so in the last decade or so, most of the effort has been focused on census and is this really real?
Yeah.
And are there places that we haven't looked for Trumpeter swans where they now may be? And so Trumpeter swans have not, if we were to look at a range map from 1910 or 1900 of what we believed, and you remember back then, like there wasn't a ton of formal biological census. This was the settlement era and things like that. And
people were worried about feeding themselves, not necessarily about species at risk.
That's right. And so really the reports of where swans were at the time were anecdotal. And then, of course, we even have the challenges that on those anecdotal reports, were those people able to actually distinguish between what was a tundra swan and what was a Trumpeter swan? Oh,
because there are tundra swans that come here as well.
Sure. Share range at different times of the year, right?
Gotcha.
And so anyway, our understanding is that Trumpeter swans were North American wide.
Gotcha.
And so they are not today, but they are in a much better spot today. And just for a North American context, again, if we go back to the cooperative survey work that was happening across North America, and so when we were doing the Alberta portion every 5 years, but that coincided with every other jurisdiction that had concerns about Trumpeter swans would complete their survey at the same time. And so again, I challenge us to think, is there any other North American model other than waterfowl where everybody is working at the same time to count the beasts and add it all up?
Probably not. I don't know.
No,
you would know better than I would.
I can't think of one, and it's very unique.
Yeah,
it was really neat to be part of that. Right?
Well, it's amazing the cooperation you need for something like this to work. Right? Is you need that amount. You need all the stakeholders involved so that everything being done is everyone's on the same page as far as what we're doing, or at least can agree that this is a way we can try to do this. Right?
That's right, and the money.
Yeah,
and the human resources to carry it out, and then the risk, and I'll talk about that as well, because the risk of spending 100 hours in an aircraft at low level, in the name of the game of science here, is not to be discounted here.
Right. So, well, I was going to say, because some other stuff that I was reading was that the pen and the cob may actually abandon the young if they're disturbed often enough, right? So
yes.
So that does happen though, hey? So
yes, absolutely.
There's something, and even what I was reading, I don't know if this is true or not, but even with low-flying aircraft could be enough to have the parents abandon the young. Yeah,
that's right. And we had put together a set of, they're called industrial guidelines, but they're basically to guide activity that was permitted around known breeding lakes, and so that was a part of one of the recovery actions.
I was going to say, I was going to ask you what were some of the restrictions on the landscape for industry, for oil and gas, for forestry, for mining, and that kind of stuff to make sure that all these users are aware of the importance of staying away from these locations. And with that being said, into the future, even though now that they're just a species of concern and not a threatened species, how do we make sure that now that the population is getting bigger, and I imagine that their range is spreading out and they're using more and more lakes, how do we ensure that, or wetlands, I should say, how do we ensure that those new wetlands that weren't previously attributed to swan existence or swan nesting areas are now attributed and everyone knows about it, so that we don't log right up to it and kick them out of there, or whatever, build a well site right on top of where they're going to put their nest or something. So that's got to be a big portion of what you guys are doing now, is kind of prevention, and not really necessary, just prevention, future prevention, right?
Yeah, and so our efforts on that front were largely focused on public land, so Crown lands in Alberta.
Yeah,
and so those guidelines were quite a simple set of guidelines, and basically it looks like this. So for any proposed activity during the breeding season, roughly from the 1st of April until the end of September, no activity permitted within a half mile of a known breeding site.
Okay.
For activities that were proposed to occur in and around Trumpeter Swan breeding lakes that were outside of when the birds would be there, they were focused on restricting the type of development so that nothing could occur inside 500 meters for long-term development. So that would be a road, a well site, something that would that had the potential to be a pretty permanent installation there.
Yeah.
Building a tower.
Right.
Running a power line. A road, even if it's a road to a well site or a gas plant or something like that, right?
Yeah.
So no development within 500 meters. Forestry operations were allowed up to 200 meters from the boundary, but if they were proposed in around a swan lake, we asked for a special management plan for those blocks between that 200 and 500 meter. And so we challenged the company to come up with a block design that was going to meet the objectives that we were looking for Trumpeter Swans. And so that was keeping it quiet.
Yeah.
Not allowing long-term access in there, not facilitating other people's access.
Making sure the roads are pulled out and everything is,
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Preservation of wetland areas that might be associated with that wetland. Making sure that we've got some kind of forest transition in cover. Many of these swan lakes are surrounded by conifer, and in fact, taller, older growth conifer.
Right.
And so what's the plan to transition from that to the harvested area?
Yeah.
Is there room for more retention to soften the transition in those cut blocks? Do you want to just avoid that 500 meters as well, right? So the number of options as to
well, that's just it. Exactly, right? Like what's more
how you want to
important,
do
the sustainability of this species of concern or some wood, right? Like we have, luckily in Alberta or in Canada, period, we have a lot of sustainable wood supply. So it's not like it's going to screw over the whole mill because they couldn't cut this one block and they had to go somewhere else, right? Like we have the capacity to do that, and those are the management decisions that need to be made. Is we need to make sure that this is sustainable for all values over time, not just wood supply. So it's exactly, that makes sense.
And then the last portion, and you referred to overflight disturbance and aircraft and things like that. Alberta has at times had an incredibly busy airspace related to industrial activity. So that's seismic exploration or tree planting or, all kinds of things.
Wildfire fighting.
Yes, all kinds of.
The number of times that we've hover exited over a wetland from a helicopter into the swamp and then walked in, right? Like, and who knows? For all I know, those could have been Trumpeter Swan nesting sites, and I just didn't notice because I was too focused on the fire or something, right? So
yeah, and we need to always make sure that we are applying common sense to these things, and so emergency firefighting operations will always trump what's going to go on in that wetland. But at the same time, part of it was just making sure folks were aware about where these sites are. And then if you have options, here's how you can design your program to avoid that. And so we had restrictions on aircraft overflight for all purposes, right?
Yeah.
But the challenge to all this is if you don't know where these birds are and you haven't communicated that, then you're going to have a hard time enforcing the guidelines around them, right?
Yeah.
And so we did take the approach that rather than, have a hard legislative line in the sand, like this is an illegal thing for you to do if you flew over that lake there. Our approach was to, communicate, make sure folks were aware of these locations, and then have it as a guideline. And tough to say at the end of the day. I mean, I think we've done a really good job of having industry adherence to those guidelines.
Yeah.
And how did we do on the aircraft side of it? It's almost impossible to monitor.
Right.
But at the end of the day, things are going well for swans now. One might ask, how important were those industrial guidelines to the recovery of trumpeter swans there? I can't tell you.
Yeah.
We know that we had to do our part. I think intuitively it was the right thing to do.
It didn't hurt. Right. To have those restrictions, it didn't hurt to have those restrictions. So you would think. And
then for the most part, there was not significant pushback or concerns expressed from industry, and I think it speaks to the fact that we have that ability in Alberta to think critically about how we achieve our goals, and we don't necessarily have to put that development there.
Yeah,
we may have options there, and I think that was. I think a pretty positive response to the guidelines.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think anybody in life needs to be told what to do, but we need that structure around species at risk at times in order to kind of do our part, right?
Yeah. Well, you need to include all the values into the thought process, right? Not just the one. So it makes sense. Totally.
So we look back now, and how important is Alberta's portion, to the North American one? Well, it progressively increased from the mid-'80s to where we are today in terms of its relative importance.
No kidding.
And so look back to, say, 1990, we had just shy of 450 swans documented in Alberta, and there was 11,000 counted in North America.
Right.
We had a pretty small piece of the pie there. Today, the last North American census, and we were part of that in 2015, Alberta had 7,700 swans, and there were 63,000 in North America. So Alberta's pulling its weight. It is it's delivering its portion of the haul in terms of growing trumpeter swans in there.
Right.
What will that mean now? Some biologists, and because we are only counting every 5 years, and this is an expensive survey, there are certainly some biologists and waterfowl managers who are now predicting that if the trend follows with what we've seen in the last 5 years, we may be seeing upwards of 10,000 new trumpeters every year across North America.
That's good. It seems like it's good, right? Like it's if we're getting back to their, historical baseline, whatever that arguably might be, right? Like you think that would be a good thing, right?
Yeah,
That's huge.
and that matches. I mean, that positive population growth matches what we see in the field. And so when we fly around, when we travel around, when we talk to our colleagues in Saskatchewan and British Columbia and Manitoba, we see many, many, many wetlands that are unoccupied by trumpeter swans and that appear to have the right recipe. So like today, there are very few, if any, trumpeter swans in the Lac La Biche area. I have to believe that they were at the turn of the century. It doesn't make any sense. I fly over those wetlands. They are productive. They meet the size requirements for these great big bombing birds with their 2.5 meter wingspan, to get a good runway in and out of these wetlands. But they don't have birds on them. And so what I think is going to happen now is that probably the best of the best in terms of habitat is occupied,
right,
or near occupied within the next decade or so. And then I think we're going to start to be seeing birds spill out. And I think now we're talking about getting back to some of the geographic distribution that we would have seen 100 and 150 years ago.
Right.
And so there are very
That's
few
awesome.
Swans in central Alberta. So east of Red Deer, almost nothing is showing up there.
Okay.
But there are suitable wetlands in there, and many of the parkland west of Edmonton here, productive wetlands. The problem is we have built it up in a pretty serious way in terms of residential subdivision, agricultural development, wetland drainage. There's a whole host of issues there, industrial developments. There, no doubt, will be portions of Alberta where the development threshold is probably too high for swans, and they won't tolerate it.
Gotcha.
And so, interestingly enough, and circling back to where we were in our discussions about Elk Island, the original recovery goal for Elk Island was to get 10 breeding pairs there, and they just about reached that.
Yeah.
And then it fizzled out. And today, in the last census in 2015, there were only 3 recorded pairs in Elk Island. And so that's an interesting question, I think, for wildlife managers. Here we have a national park. From a land-based perspective, doesn't get any more secure than that. Any proposal to develop anything inside there would undergo significant scrutiny and time and review and things like that. And yet they're not having met their really modest recovery goal. 20% of Elk Island is water.
Well, I was going to say, though,
it's a huge amount of water.
Right. But it's pretty active. Like, there's a lot of people in and out of there every year, right?
Active, but it is right next door to the Cooking Lake Blackfoot Grazing Reserve as well. But again, another active kind of area. There's lots going on there, right?
That's my thought, is maybe it's just a little bit too active, too loud, too many people.
It's certainly possible, and I think that pattern is likely to repeat itself across North America. And so will we achieve full range recovery to what it was? I doubt it.
Yeah.
I think it's probably not geographically possible.
Right.
Socially possible.
Right.
Really, right? Without major changes, right? Mm-hmm. Interestingly enough, there's a lake right in the city of Grand Prairie called Crystal Lake. Okay. And you picture it's a typical kind of stormwater pond lake, completely ringed with the city there. Mm-hmm. And in about 2007, 2008 in there, a pair of swans nested, hatched, and then, gosh darn it, if all the cygnets weren't killed by stray dogs and cats over the next 3 weeks, right?
Yeah.
And so swans have that ability to show that they'll tolerate some of this behavior, but to get their brood across the finish line, they're not achieving that.
Yeah, that's a tough part.
Right.
That makes sense. Do they have much of a natural predator?
Well,
is there anything that's like, that's
it's a great question, right? Over the years, we've basically seen very little instances of predation. Trumpeter swans, certainly, as we've discussed, are under the influence of weather strongly. Mm-hmm. And so trumpeter swans are returned to Alberta, set up shop in early May and begin those breeding and incubation activities in early May. If they're met with, and it's very common for us to get a significant snowfall. Yeah. How many times did you spend your May long weekend in your trailer under 8 inches of wet, fluffy snow, right?
Yeah.
And so for us in the trailer, means we can't fish, perhaps. For a trumpeter swan that's, in the mid stages of incubating there, that could be a catastrophic type of situation.
Yeah.
To maintain the energy balance and keep those eggs warm under that driving snow condition. Spring flooding is another issue, and these birds build this massive 6 or 7 foot diameter nest there, but nothing can stop Mother Nature when she decides to rain and flow.
Yeah.
And so flood events can create situations where the wetlands are not, they're dynamic and water levels are changing. Drought is another one, and so if wetlands trumpeter swans require a good, stable, high water wetland typically. But if it's dropping or rising, that's not good for them.
Right.
But the interesting thing is, based on the data that we have of what kills trumpeter swans, their power lines have been the number one documented issue for trumpeter swan.
So that's why you were mentioning the power line and the cell phone towers and that kind of stuff.
Okay. And so nothing will ever replace the due diligence that goes around proper route planning for these things.
Yeah.
But certainly, I think we were a little bit surprised, and perhaps it's maybe counterintuitive on where we have seen power line mortality occurring. And so certainly, from my background, there's been lots of study on waterfowl, the negative impacts of waterfowl under major transmission line development. So this is the huge tower, multi-wire, very tall and run for many, many hundreds of kilometers transmission lines. And intuitively, that works for me. We got multiple wires. It goes a long ways. They're really high. It would seem that would be the major problem site for a bird that has trouble maneuvering. And remember, trumpeter swans are huge.
Yeah, 2.5 meter wingspan is
30 pounds. These are like jetliners coming, and they do not have. We've all watched little birds that sit on the road, and as you drive towards them, at the last minute they're able to jump up in the air and flit off to the side and hopefully avoid the bumper. Right?
Yeah.
This is not a bird like that. This is a bird that has a long approach into the wetland. With a gliding activity, a very poor ability to make last-minute adjustments to the rudders.
Yeah, if a chickadee is a fighter jet, then the swan is a 747.
That's right. And then similarly, upon takeoff, there's a long process to achieving airborne here. And so we're talking about a few great big paddles of the feet along the water as they gain the momentum and they're pushing themselves along there. And then they've got their line that they're taking off. Well, if you can picture, a small breeding wetland in the county of Grand Prairie that's maybe got a 115-year-old family farm not too far nearby, but then has a new country residential acreage subdivision that's gone up there, and the single power line that services that country residential. Or that oil and gas well site, or that communications tower, or whatever it is, stretches across, the only opening being the trees on that wetland.
Yeah.
That has been really the problem area, for trumpeter swan collisions.
Go around those things, not over. Yeah. That's a tough one.
And so it's, I guess in hindsight, we shouldn't be surprised. Big power lines are heavily regulated. There is typically a lot of time that goes into the route planning.
Yeah.
They are huge structures with that are really quite visible.
Yeah.
Some of them have lights and other things periodically on them. The towers themselves are big, imposing structures that increase the visibility of the whole unit. And then here we have a single line that stretches maybe 40 or 50 yards through an opening along the edge of a wetland there, and the bird can't see it.
Yeah. And like you said, they don't have the maneuverability to do it last second, right?
That's right. And a lot of our engineering discussions and solutions have been around, well, rather than bury that portion of the line, rather than re-engineer that portion of the line at all the cost, why don't we just stick something and hang something on it?
Those buoys on it that you guys usually see over rivers and stuff.
Buoys, right? And there's some curly fiberglass things that are supposed to glow in the dark that look like the interior filament of a light bulb, kind of, and they're designed to increase the thickness and break up that uniform visibility of the single power line across there. There are things that spin and flap and turn. and whatever. The bottom line is none of those will work at night. None of those will work in a blinding snowstorm when that bird is flying. And typically in North America, we see some of our biggest mortality events amongst birds when we get spring and fall storms that coincide with the migration period.
Gotcha.
Right? And so engineering is part of the solution. I would argue that the costs to deal with some of those engineering controls are probably better spent just biting the bullet and burying that section of power line. It will be done forever. The challenge from the power company's perspective has been taking Alberta's principally above ground power distribution network and now putting portions of it underground. And so the maintenance costs are more difficult, or increase and more difficult. The logistics are more difficult. And so if a pole breaks, a line breaks, a transformer blows, we can physically see where that is.
Yeah.
And the linemen go in and do their thing and fix that thing. Well, now if we have portions of power line that are buried, we have to excavate. And how do we excavate in February?
Yeah.
And portions like that. And so we know that from a power outage perspective, we typically have things up and running in a matter of hours unless it's a catastrophic storm here. That would not be the case if we had portions buried underground. I would just argue that if we were going to work on less than 100 sites in the whole province, the chances of breaks occurring at those would be far less vulnerability. I can guarantee you a buried power line cannot blow over.
Right.
So there are I think there's still room for some discussion there.
Yeah.
We were successful in doing a number of projects there. Again, from a stewardship standpoint, the locations of some of those sites in southwestern Alberta were around key staging wetlands in the spring and fall where trumpeters need to have their rest stop on that migration.
Yeah.
And those ranchers and landowners down there, when it came time to renew their 60 or 70-year-old power lines in there, said, hey, we want it underground now for all the right reasons here, and we're going to be able to proverbially kill two birds with one stone here. or not kill two birds with one stone, right? And so we were able to be a successful partner with Fortis on a couple of locations down there, and we partnered up in the county of Grand Prairie on some engineering controls, trying these different things. But they're very difficult to evaluate the success of engineering controls on power lines because you would have to run some kind of a monitoring experiment.
Yeah.
You'd have to observe birds, and then you'd actually have to find the carcass of a bird underneath there. And we have so many scavengers that that carcass would be eliminated in hours.
Yeah.
And so it's almost an impossible task. And so that's why I would just rather we not spend our time on that and we just fix it.
Yeah,
that we know is going to work.
Well, it makes sense. Totally. Coming up on the end here, like we've been going well over, or almost coming up on an hour and a half because it flies, right? It just goes by so fast. I wanted to, so is there like a resource that like say like industry, if they don't know about any industry, or if they want to know where some of these sites are, some of these lakes are, is there a place, like is there a part of the government website that says, like, there's a map of where these places are and where they need to avoid? And are you guys updating that as you recognize new nesting sites?
Yeah, so there's a process whereby industry proponents can request that data through the Environment and Parks data management folks, and so that contact information is available on the Environment and Parks website under land use guidelines there.
Do you want to send me that link and I'll throw it in the show notes?
Sure.
So that people for the industry that wants it, they'll they can look into it.
Yeah, you bet.
Cool.
I think one of the challenges going forward is how do we best maintain that database? And so if we look at that, we've gone from, maybe several hundred sites in Alberta of confirmed breeding pairs to now potentially more than 1,000. How will we maintain that over time?
Yeah,
that's certainly a challenge, or it gets expensive.
I could see a place where if we don't maintain it over time, we could see ourselves in another similar situation, right? Just from expanding into the wilderness in quotations and impacting negatively those places, right? So,
that's right.
Yeah.
And then the second challenge is that as we move forward here, we are in discussions right now as to how will we complete the next survey in 2020?
Yeah.
What will the form of that survey look like? And we've gone in the past from a total count survey where we are flying around to every wetland, counting adults and cygnets in late August, adding that up to, in 2010, we realized that the cost and the time that it was taking for that survey were becoming increasingly prohibitive.
Yeah.
And so we changed to a stratified random sampling block survey where we were only surveying portions of the Trumpeter Swan range and extrapolating population counts based on the information that we found from the surveyed plots. I expect that we'll be continuing on with that survey design in 2020, if at all. And the survey in 2015 cost the Alberta portion $100,000. And if we're going to look at increasing our geographic scope of that survey, now we're going to be north of $100,000, and we're only one jurisdiction across North America. And so in the whole picture here now, at 63,000 Trumpeter Swans across North America in 2015, we could be north of 80,000 coming into 2020. Will we carry on with the survey?
Well, what about like a similar method that that of course you know about is like hunter harvest surveys, right? So like obviously it wouldn't be a harvest survey, but it would be like a reporting process where the public can go online and say, hey, I saw 2 Trumpeter Swans here, and they put a pin on a map, right? I saw them here or whatever. I think that would probably be a good way to help you guys kind of situate where everything is at, right? Is there something like that available?
We have that now.
Oh, you do? Okay.
And so there's ability to capture that data now, and we do get some of that data. The challenge would be will it keep up? And maybe it's some combination of things. Because we've got a historical database now. If you're an industrial proponent or maybe a recreation activity proponent looking to develop something around some wetland that appears to meet suitability requirements, maybe the onus is on you now to do your portion and make sure that the pre-survey work is completed before and in the planning stage of the activity that can help contribute to that.
Yeah.
And then maybe some combination of modified aerial surveys going forward there.
Yeah.
But no doubt under the fiscal pressures and the number of species that we have to count, the level of risk involved in all of that aerial survey work, I think we certainly in the next year and a half will be having a discussion about how we want to move forward and what we recommend to move forward for future aerial counts.
Still, I mean, ultimately this is like probably one of the biggest successes in wildlife conservation that I can think of, right? Like having this kind of a return, and it's super just uplifting to hear that this is actually working, and to know that over that 100-year time scale, it's possible that what might seem really bleak right now with other species, like for caribou, for example, we might be able to bring those back with the proper steps being taken, right? So it's good to know that we can have an impact even when it does seem super bleak and unlikely, right?
Yeah, it's been a really neat run.
Yeah.
A really neat story, a ton of cooperation, a ton of effort, and it's been really rewarding to be part of that. For sure.
No, that's awesome. Yeah. Well, do you have any final words of wisdom or anything you want to say before we sign off? If not, we can just end it
not
there.
really. Yeah.
Okay,
that's good.
There you go. Thanks a lot for coming on, man. This is
You're
great.
welcome.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks a lot for listening, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Mark's an awesome dude. He definitely knows what he's talking about. So I hope you guys like that. If you have any questions from myself or from Mark, you can contact me at yourforestpodcast@gmail.com. I will definitely get back to you. Thanks a lot for listening. We'll check you guys out next time. Take it easy.